Australia's natural and cultural heritage is irreplaceable. Over the 50 million years of our continent's geographic isolation, an extensive variety of plants and animals has evolved here. Australia has more unique species than any other nation on the planet. With changes in land use over the last 200 years and the threat of climate change, it is increasingly important that a diverse range of healthy, functioning ecosystems remain viable and capable of supporting life. Australia has an extensive network of public national parks and reserves, which aim to protect examples of the full range of these natural ecosystems and landscape features as part of the National Reserve System. Yet all the public conservation reserves make up less than 9% of the land area of New South Wales and still dramatically underrepresent the spectrum of different biological regions or bioregions across the state. Which is why the National Reserve System also provides for the establishment of protected areas on private land across Australia. These areas help complement the important conservation values found in our core public conservation reserves in terms of representation, connectivity and resilience. The New South Wales Department of Environment, Climate Change and Water operates a Conservation Partners Program that enables partnerships with private landholders, Aboriginal communities, non-government, government and industry landholders who want to help protect and conserve places of natural and cultural heritage significance on their land across the state, particularly those in rare and unique ecosystems in underrepresented bioregions.
Well, in New South Wales, we have a range of different ecosystems that are organised in what we call bioregions. There's about 19 of those across the state, and many of them are quite underrepresented in public reserves. The role of private land conservation is very important in this regard. Another very important concept is connectivity in the landscape, where we're looking at complementing public reserves with private land conservation across the landscape. So private land conservation has a really, really important role. It's an inclusive process. It's about people, private landholders, committing their land for conservation under a range of options.
The Conservation Partners Program offers two types of conservation partnerships to enable private or public landholders to formally protect part or all of their land by voluntarily proclaiming an area as a wildlife refuge or entering into a conservation agreement over an area. Both options provide legal protection for important wildlife and its habitats and significant natural and cultural heritage. Conservation agreements protecting natural heritage and biodiversity are eligible for inclusion in the National Reserve System.
Got an active malleefowl mound here.
Oh, right.
Yeah. This one's been recently excavated.
We've got a wide range of landholders who are involved in the conservation partnerships, ranging from private landholders who are involved with agricultural enterprises and do conservation as part of their work. Also, we have landholders who have a particular interest in conservation, so they are managing their lands primarily for conservation. We have the non-government organisations who are working predominantly in the area of conservation, who have conservation agreements with us, as well as the universities that have education research facilities. So there are a range of landholders that can find a compatibility with conservation as part of their work and their purpose.
A wildlife refuge under the National Parks and Wildlife Act provides for the protection and conservation of wildlife and its habitats. It enables landholders to set aside natural bushland and also continue to manage areas for agricultural production, industrial uses, utilities or tourism compatible with wildlife conservation, or to carry out native animal release programs. A conservation agreement under the National Parks and Wildlife Act provides a higher level of protection and is an in perpetuity legal arrangement, a conservation covenant that passes on to successive owners. It provides for the protection and conservation of significant natural environments, scenery and geological formations, native biodiversity, including critical habitats of threatened species, endangered ecological communities, and the study and care of native plants and animals. A conservation agreement also enables the formal protection of Aboriginal objects or places of special cultural significance, sites of historic buildings. Objects, monuments, or even of national significance may also be included.
The Australian Wildlife Conservancy is a non-government organisation which owns and manages land for conservation. We've got 21 properties throughout Australia, about 2.6 million hectares on those properties. On Scotia, as well as protecting those vegetation communities, there is also the largest endangered species recovery program occurring on mainland Australia. We've got 8,000 hectares behind a feral-free enclosure, and within those 8,000 hectares there is not a single feral animal, and we've reintroduced a number of species that are extinct in New South Wales, such as the bridle nail-tail wallaby, the bilby, the booty, the woylie, and a number of other species, including the numbat. The conservation agreement gives certainty for AWC that the government has recognised that this place is a special place and needs to be protected for conservation. It also sends a signal to the wider community, our neighbours and others in New South Wales, that this is a special place and that the conservation benefits outweigh any other benefits that might exist.
White Leads is a small grazing Western Lands lease that Marg and myself were fortunate enough to purchase 3 years ago, and it's very exciting for us. We've elected to consent to the property being a wildlife refuge. We would like to share this land and opportunity with other people, and to work closely with the national parks I think is special, and also to involve yourself with other stakeholders and teammates is pretty good. And if we can work together to give opportunity for education, arid zone rehabilitation and opportunity for conservation, I think that's pretty special as I move forward.
We're surrounded by a Eucalyptus gillii woodland, which is better known as curly mallee. Curly mallee is endemic to this region. It only grows here and some in the northern side of the Flinders Ranges in South Australia. And this landholder has decided to help to protect that underneath a conservation agreement. It's a beautiful landscape. The geology, the rock formations and the vegetation. This particular tree here has beautiful soft blue foliage. It's used in nursery landscaping, and just to see it naturally growing in the wild is really beautiful.
The University of New South Wales have an arid zone research station. Basically, we do everything associated with arid areas. We do everything from climate change through to wildlife studies, mainly kangaroo and avian studies. And also sheep research. We've done a lot of sheep research out here and looking at better ways of maximising land return for farmers in rural areas. The ferals have done a lot of damage out here, and the idea is to fence off these areas and monitor recovery. Now, a little known fact, in the 1880s, this country out here supported about 20 million sheep. And after that, when we first settled on this land, now after they knocked out the vegetation that was already growing on the land, the land west of the Darlings only supported about 5 million sheep since then. So you've had a massive drop-off in the population density of animals you can support. And that's simply because the vegetation has been removed.
Some of the examples of wildlife refuges, they are usually quite large and they are usually integrated conservation with other activities on the properties. and it helps in the landscape to provide the habitats and the corridors that provide the linkages. The ability of wildlife to survive and thrive in the face of climate change will depend very much on areas that are managed sympathetically to help protect wildlife and help conserve wildlife into the future.
It started off through our connections through Landcare, and we had a few grants. We got a Bidgie Banks grant some years ago to do some fencing and planting. And we got to know some of the people in the department, and who said, well, look, there are these options that you can go for. There is various levels of protection of the property if that's what you want to do. And so we thought about that. So we looked into the Voluntary Conservation Agreement, which went on your title. And so I suppose that's where we started from.
Our long-term goals for this property would be to have a property that is in natural balance, no weeds, no feral animals. That's our goal.
I've always been interested in the river and native wildlife, and we're very keen to get a place with river frontage, with the view to building a home there in the future. But I gradually developed more interest in revegetation that would support wildlife and be a bit of a model on how the country may have looked a couple of 100 years ago. Having had some achievement in revegetation, not a lot, but some achievement, and having ideas of achieving more, I started to think about how can that be protected into the future, because it would only take a dozen sheep for a year, or let the rabbits run riot for a short period, and a lot of the work would be undone. So I thought the best way I could see would be to get involved in a conservation agreement. I guess the fundamental is I just see us as stewards of the landscape, and to try and leave some example of being a bit better than when you found it. So I guess that's the underlying driver, if you like.
Nanya is a property, now 40,000 hectare property, with very high vegetation diversity. Through a long period of time, got to know the area very well and identified Nanya as one of the most significant properties. And that led to its purchase by the university with the assistance from the Australian government. And we now use it for teaching, research, and of course to conserve its very high biodiversity values. A lot of effort went into purchasing Nanya, and we want to ensure that it is absolutely permanently reserved and its values are retained for everyone and for the value of the biodiversity, in perpetuity. It's just an act of faith, if you like, to ensure that the conservation values are maintained.
Ben Ricketts is a special place because it's got warm temperate rainforest on it, it's got tall moist forest, and it's got heathland. And those three give quite a variety, and there's the ecotones between them. And we had a property here that had a good mix of different types of habitats. Plus we had the cabins where people can come and stay and enjoy these forests. We're getting third generation people coming and staying in the cabins, third generation people are shareholders. And so it's got this long connection with the land. These forests are very important on the Illawarra Escarpment. It's very important because of its proximity to Barren Grounds Nature Reserve and the species that live in these forests. And so there can be movement of birds between the rainforest and the tall moist forest and up onto the heathland of the Barren Grounds.
Very difficult to feel you have any influence in the world. And one of the things you can do through this wonderful program of the Conservation Covenants is make a decision that is binding, that affects the world in a small way. You can buy a property, you can still live there, but you can actually bring into force a protective regime that means that the thing will be unchanged. And that's a wonderful thing.
Many landholders who have special places on their properties want to leave a legacy for future generations. And when you think about the 92% of land that is in private land holdings and other public lands that have those important and significant conservation values, it's very important that landholders have the opportunity to get involved in conservation.
Both conservation partnerships are formal commitments under the National Parks and Wildlife Act, with ongoing monitoring and support through the Conservation Partners Program. The legal basis of these arrangements ensures their security, as well as legal protection for landholders from unauthorised activities on their land, such as trespassing, shooting and hunting, prospecting, picking or harming wildlife and their habitats. In recognition of a private landholder's commitment to conservation agreement landholders can access a range of rate and tax exemptions and concessions, which can help offset costs associated with their conservation management. The Conservation Partners Program provides ongoing monitoring and support services to assist landholders with conservation management of their land.
That process has been very enjoyable. It was an initial phone call to a local ranger in Broken Hill, Paul Seeger. Paul visited Margaret and myself and took us through some steps. National Parks and Wildlife has assisted us through those steps all the way, which has been very enjoyable. Margaret and myself have given them assistance to show them what the property is, what we think it can offer, the benefits at the end of the day as National Parks Wildlife being a stakeholder in our project as we move forward.
It was very interesting and exciting. It meant that some people from the Park Service came out and walked over the place with us, got to know it well. I've lived here for over 30 years, so I know it pretty well, so I could take them to interesting parts. Because we were so keen to have the land protected, we weren't anxious about the process.
The person we were dealing with was from DECC. She was most helpful. It was a step-by-step process, and we had a draft conservation agreement which was drawn up very much in partnership. I think I felt all the way through that it was a partnership, wasn't it? That our needs were being met and the department were focusing on what their needs were too. I mean, if anything, they bent over backwards to accommodate what our needs might be, things we hadn't really thought of, perhaps.
I guess the main underlying value of a riverfront property is the ability to build on it. So it was important to protect that right. So to do so, I set aside two separate lots to give two options, might be say a bit over an acre each or whatever it is, that have frontage and are capable of being built on in accordance with the agreement.
Many conservation agreements are usually over part of the land, not the whole property.
One of the main factors was the unknown. You're launching into the unknown. You've invested some funds in a property, and on one hand, I wanted to achieve the landscape outcomes, but also to protect the value of your investment. Going into the unknown was a factor, but National Parks and Wildlife are very helpful in talking things through and looking through at outcomes. I was satisfied that the outcomes would be positive.
We thought about what the conservation agreement might do in terms of saleability of the property down the track, but in a way, our view was that if you were going to protect it, then that's just the sort of instrument that you did need.
I think if anything, it might increase our chances because somebody might say, that's just the sort of place I want. The hard yards have been put in, we've got rid of most of the weeds, we're managing it very well, and that might be encouraging to potential buyers.
Landholders are really interested to know more about their vegetation and their ecological communities. They're becoming more aware of diversifying their industry.
These conservation partnerships also enable easier access to additional management and maintenance funding available from other funding bodies. As the issue of environment and biodiversity, climate change and sustainability grows, there also grows a potential for even greater recognition at the local, state and national level.
Usually, once we've set up the agreement, there will be a ranger who goes out and has a look at the property, talks to the landholder and sees how they're going. Often there's funding available if new problems come up, so if a new weed occurs on the property, we can often help the landholder find a way to manage that weed, or if there's an increase in feral species, we can help the landholder deal with those kind of issues.
The Park Service provides some support. We've had support from the service with building fences to keep neighbours' stock out. Not only that, their knowledge and their enthusiasm is very supportive.
When we first entered into the voluntary conservation agreement, we got a grant to do some bush regeneration, which was very helpful. That lasted for 3 years. And we've also just recently got one of the private land conservation grants, which is a partnership of DECCW and other bodies.
While changing land use and development have had a significant impact over the last few centuries, threatening many ecosystems, bioregions, landscapes, plants, wildlife and their migration patterns, there are many wildlife habitats and corridors in the landscape that still exist in their natural state and are able to be protected and conserved. Taking the opportunity to create a positive long-term legacy for the benefit of current and future generations through private and public land conservation efforts can make an important contribution to the long-term protection of Australia's natural and cultural heritage.
Across Australia and across a lot of countries, land is being used in quite a short-term way, and I think there needs to be a good balance between conservation and production. We felt that our block was we could make a contribution to that conservation side of land use, and we also, I suppose, in a deeper way, have an affinity, which a lot of people do, affinity with the land, and to see the land recovering and to see it healthy is a very satisfying thing.
Whilst we clearly need to continue grazing large areas if we want wool and sheep and productivity from the land, but we also have a moral responsibility to look after what we've inherited, and if we can find the patches that have the best examples, then they are the places that we need to identify and protect and retain their character.
The purpose is to enable those species to be protected. There's a lot of activity that's occurred over the last 200 years, and many species have become extinct, and many others are on the brink of extinction. So unless we do these sort of measures, then we'll lose more and more species. And I don't think, as a community, that we find that acceptable. And I think if you went out to the community, that overwhelmingly people would feel that the protection of species is an important objective.
I guess from a philosophical point of view, it's recognising that the government simply cannot do everything, that in one way we have to be responsible ourselves for the footprint that we put on the earth. It's wanting to have, I guess, some ownership, but it's more custodianship. It's trying to preserve what there is, prevent it from becoming worse, but knowing that you've made some contribution.
I would say the chance to protect the natural values of your property is a wonderful thing, and not only that, it's something that not many of us have a chance to do. If you're lucky enough to own a piece of land, to be the steward to a piece of land, it's an exciting opportunity to look after it in a way that you can't do on your own, perhaps.
to live on the site, to witness and breathe it is speechless and priceless. There's no words for it.
The world is an interactive place. We depend on it, on the natural systems for our own existence, and we have to look after them. I mean, philosophically, it's very basic to me that the notion of conserving the world enables us to continue in the world.
Having a conservation agreement or wildlife refuge on your land is an important statement about the landholder commitment and the efforts in protecting our unique and diverse bioregions across the state and Australia as part of the National Reserve System. If you'd like to consider a conservation agreement or wildlife refuge and believe that some of your land may have significant natural or cultural heritage values, please don't hesitate to contact us for more information and to make an application for assessment.